Hey folks, Roger here. I had an idea. So I thought that I would take some time and share some of the great books from Western civilization, from world thought, that have really been influential in um, world thinking, that have had some major impact, or books that have perhaps encapsulated ideas of the era, and just take some time and walk with you some of those books. So if you are interested in the big questions like I am, if you're interested in how we got here, where we're going, how the modern world was shaped, then this might be something you're interested in. So I'll just share with you some of the books that I've already read. I'll read some passages with you, try to explain just at some basic level what the books are about, and then share some of my own thoughts about it, and maybe how that book has helped to shape a bit about where we are in our current cultural moment. So you probably already know, but I see the books behind me as sort of a map. We can retrace our steps to see how we got here by listening to the voices from the past. We've shared that I and thinkers wiser than myself see really this is all one great conversation. So, beginning with the ancient Greeks and the pre Socratic philosophers, going through the Socratics into the Greco Roman period, with many other cultures having a say or some influence, and then going into the after the fall of Rome, the really the Christian period, moving into Europe and then into America. All these voices, and even broader than that from around the world, having something to say, and so much of it is valuable. But even for those things that I would disagree with, boy, have they really helped to shape the world that we live in now. So if I'm trying to understand the world we live in now in our current cultural climate, this moment, I would do well, and so would you, I think, to not begin today, but to sort of look back and see how we got here. So I'll be sharing with you some of these books that perhaps I don't agree with entirely, but they were influential or they encapsulated some great idea. So we'll look at books from the Enlightenment period, the modern world, postmodern thinkers, medieval Christian thinkers, and perhaps some antiquity. We'll see how much time I have for this or how much time you have, but we'll try to make these bite-sized, easy to digest, just enjoyable videos. So if these are something you're interested in, I hope you stick around. We'll just call this playlist Roger Reads. Let's get to it. So what better place to start was with one of the most famous books from the Enlightenment period, and that is Voltaire. Voltaire's Candide. This is my copy of it. I've also got an Audible. You can get this jolly, really happy fellow reading the book on Audible, and it's kind of hilarious because it's a very dark book. I will say this up front: Candide by Voltaire is not a kid-friendly book. It is very violent. It's R-rated. Even if it's said sort of tongue-in-cheek, and this stuff is discussed with some bit of humor, it's still extremely violent and sort of unsettling, the material. There is extreme violence, there's rape, there's probably some racial prejudice, there's things like this in there. Before we read this, this book was written, I think, in the 1700s, but it was written by Voltaire, who, as I'm sure you know, was a major thinker, writer, pamphleteer in the Enlightenment. And what was the Enlightenment? Well, I grew up sort of thinking that the Middle Ages were the dark ages, that hated science, hated reason. And then, boy, as I've studied and had to read, and in some of the graduate work I've done, I was forced to come to terms with some bit of modern prejudice, some secular prejudices I've had. And then when you read these folks for yourself from the Middle Ages and antiquity, you see that were they alive today to defend themselves, some of these flippant modernist critiques of the medieval and ancient worlds would not stand. These folks are just dead, and they can't defend themselves. Now, there were problems. I don't think there's utopia in the past any more than perhaps a leftist, far left person might think utopias in the future. But boy, did this discussion and the things that we take for granted today, they didn't happen in a vacuum. These things have been developing for centuries and millennia, including through the Middle Ages. But what was the Enlightenment, if not these folks deemed the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, and they turned on the light, they enlightened. And what did they enlighten humanity with? Well, human reason. We're the ones who enjoy the natural sciences and reason, and we're going to turn on the light and cast out superstition and things like this. And so it's helpful to see the Enlightenment in its context as well. Prior to the Enlightenment in Western civilization, well, the foundations had been torn up. The things from antiquity, the Greco-Roman conversations, and through the Christian period in which you had thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, Athanasius, these ideas that were playing themselves out in law and art and culture. Well, you also had some superstitious folks, and you did have some violence, and you had things that were less than ideal. You had economic systems that leaved something to be desired, and the Enlightenment thought, hey, we're going to go full into market economics and science and reason and humanism and progress and toss out the old things. Well, what led to that early modern period, I think, was the ideas feeding into the Reformation, William of Ockham, and some of the ideas of nominalism, Martin Luther, Machiavelli. These are the things that are in the cultural climate leading into the 1500s that sort of began to crumble these things that were established in Western civilization. This included religion. So when the Enlightenment came along, think Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Voltaire, these fellows, these folks, they had already come to think that a lot of what was said was Christianity was simply propaganda by the Catholic Church that created Christianity to control the masses, and that they, even though they were more deists and really thought of God conceptually different than Orthodox Christians traditionally would have, he was sort of a God far away somewhere who wasn't doing miracles and doing things in our lives. He was just a God who maybe Jesus just showed us some morally nice things. Well, that caused them to question, as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams did during this Enlightenment period, the Trinity. This caused Voltaire to talk well of Christianity in some regards, but as I've read some historians say, was sort of a propagandist in that he denied or rejected so many things traditionally thought of in Christianity. It was sort of just a time of major cultural, philosophical, religious shift that really reshaped and uprooted what had been in Western civilization for so long. And that's going into, I think, right before the Reformation period, into the Reformation, into the Enlightenment period, and these are the beginnings of the modern world. So what is Candide? This is Voltaire's, considered one of his greatest works. This is a short book. You can probably read it in 4 hours, plus or minus a little bit, depending how fast you read. It's not difficult to understand. But what takes place in this is it's a story. It's written as a novella, just a short novel, and Voltaire has many characters in this book in which he's, I think, commenting on some of the ideas and thinkers of his day and those who came before him. But he is using this story as an opportunity to say something. And I think it really sort of encapsulates something about the Enlightenment, Voltaire. So I don't get too hung up on all the many characters, but there are some very important characters. So what takes place is a young man named Candide is in love with a young woman. And Candide, I think, means candid, simple, straightforward. And that's his name. So he's in love with a young woman, and they are both involved in, they love the natural sciences. They're, I think, a little bit young, a little naive, And they have a friend named Professor Pangloss. Now, Professor Pangloss is, he is, in fact, his name has become, I think, a verb or an adverb, adjective, depending how you use it. Uh, if you say someone's rather Pangloss, it means they're rather optimistic regardless of the circumstances. Well, that comes from this character, Professor Pangloss. And what he did was he thought that all things are as they should be. So he used the phrase that this is the best of all possible worlds. Now, I think Professor Pangloss and perhaps Voltaire was a little philosophically confused about what that would mean, to my mind, in a philosophical sense. But let's take Voltaire on his own terms. What Professor Pangloss meant in the story was that the world really couldn't be better, and that he states somewhere in the book that what he means by that is that all things are as they should be and all things are good. So you had to take the good with the bad. They couldn't really be better. Now, philosophically, I've studied arguments for the existence of God that talk about, or about what God would foreknow about history if God created the universe knowing full well what human beings would do. Did he determine that these things would happen, or did he give human beings freedom of choice? And you can talk about the best of all possible worlds. Why did God create a world in which he knew human beings would rebel and fall as a species, as a race, and cause suffering if the Christian narrative is true? G.K. Chesterton, I think, once said that original sin is the one thing you can prove, because you just got to look around you or look inside. There is something broken about the human race. But that use of the phrase best of all possible worlds is slightly different, I think, than what Professor Pangloss means. He simply means that, hey, this is as good as it gets. It couldn't be better. Take the good with the bad. And no matter what happens, Professor Pangloss is just optimistic. So this young couple believe him. But then as the story unfolds, the main character, Candide, travels around the world. Terrible things happen. And you really get a good survey of the depravity of the human species in this book. I do not recommend it for children. And excuse my language, I won't go into detail, but there is murder, racial prejudice, romantic or sexual infidelity. There is slavery, which was still very much a thing in Voltaire's day. There is religious persecution. There's violent rape, sexual abuse, forced sexual slavery. There's just all sorts of terrible, violent things. There's descriptions of terrible things that humans do. Well, Candide keeps this idea that his friend Professor Pangloss gives him. This is the best of all possible worlds. And Professor Pangloss had said something like, yeah, the terrible things that happen with slavery, or maybe to the Native Americans, or etc., were bad, but hey, and maybe we got diseases, but hey, but we also get chocolate. So you take the bad with the good. This is as good as it gets. Well, Professor Pangloss really has a terrible time with some things he faces, and he said, yeah, but this is as good as it gets. All things are as they should be. And so Candide and his lovely young romantic love, Cunegande, they just believe him until she is taken captive. She's raped. Candide thinks she's dead. Things are so violent for her. He later finds out she's alive, and he goes around the world looking for her, because as all these things happen, as all the terrible things happen to his friends, and the things he sees humans do to each other, he kind of maintains this optimism by focusing on this young woman whom he loves, Cunegande, as, yeah, but she's the brightness in the world for this. He sort of fixates her as the center of what he thinks is goodness and optimism and hope. But then, unfortunately, Candide not only observes the evil in the world, but he also begins to contribute to it. He winds up murdering, I think, at least 3 people. one of whom was a friend, an acquaintance. He causes suffering, meaning to do well. With good intentions, he causes suffering in others, and he contributes to the suffering and pain in the human race. And then at the end of the book, somewhere about halfway through the book, he starts to say, I wish Professor Pangloss was here to explain all these terrible things, and he could tell us how it's all as good as it gets, it's all as it should be, and I'd offer some objections. And this also gives Voltaire an opportunity to take shots at those he doesn't agree with, including the Catholic Church. He has his character Candide meet someone outside of the historic Christian religion who believes in God and worships God, and he says, Candide says, "Hey, where's your priests? Where's your monks?" "Oh, we don't have monks." And Candide says, "Well, don't you have people to debate and argue about abstract things and burn people efficiently?" This is just Voltaire's sort of satirical way of taking his jabs at what he sees as the people still in the Dark Ages. But then after all this, Candide finally, after going around the world and talking with different people who were trying to make sense of the suffering in the world in their own way, maybe there was a better way. Maybe there's a good God and a bad God, and the evil God is inflicting torment on us. Maybe this is just what human beings do. Scorpions sting, hawks hunt, men pillage and rape, and inflict suffering. Maybe that's what it is. Well, what about the fall? What about original sin? Well, maybe that's meant to be too, so that we can have things like chocolate. I think philosophically we could critique Voltaire here. At the end of the book, and it's worth reading if you're an adult, mature person, Cunegonde and Professor Pangloss did survive, and Candide's very happy about this. He finally finds them, but the problem is, for Candide, Cunegonde is no longer lovely or beautiful. In fact, she's quite ugly and grows uglier every day. She's been through so much in her life, it's taken a toll on her physically. She's not the young, beautiful, optimistic woman interested in science that Candide fell in love with, and now he doesn't want to marry her. And again, I think often as we see suffering in the world, we tend to externalize it. It's always someone else who's caused this, and we very rarely feel comfortable looking inside and say, have I contributed to this? Are there other problems in my own heart? Well, I think Voltaire is right to sort of say, yeah, Candide also is selfish and romantically unfaithful, and has caused suffering and even murdered this young, naive, optimistic young man. Well, he marries Cunegonde, and his life is not what he wanted it to be, but he finds some small comfort. And so in the end, he's talking with those who are still around, his acquaintances, and here's just a passage from Voltaire's Candide. This is towards the end. "Master," said he, "we come to beg you to tell why so strange an animal as man was made." "With that meddlest thou," said the dervish. "Is it thy business?" "But, reverend father," said Candide, "there is horrible evil in this world." "What signifies it," said the dervish, "whether there be evil or good? When his highness sends a ship to Egypt, does he trouble his head whether the mice on board are at their ease or not?" "What then must we do?" said Pangloss, the optimistic professor, who no longer believes in his optimism. "Hold your tongue," answered the dervish. "I was in hopes," said Pangloss, "that I should reason with you a little about the causes and effects, about the best of possible worlds, the origin of evil, the nature of the soul, and the pre-established harmony." At these words, the dervish shut the door in their faces. During this conversation, the news was spread that 2 viziers and mufti had been strangled at Constantinople, and that several of their friends had been impaled. This catastrophe made a great noise for some hours. Pangloss, Candide, and Martin, returning to the little farm, saw a good old man taking the fresh air at his door under the orange bower. Pangloss, who was as inquisitive as he was argumentative, asked the old man what was the name of the strangled mufti. "I do not know," said the worthy man, "and I have not known the name of any mufti or any vizier. I am entirely ignorant of the event you mention. I presume, in general, that they who meddle with the administration of public affairs die sometimes miserably, and that they deserve it. But I cannot trouble my head what is transacting at Constantinople. I content myself with sending there for sale of the fruits of the garden which I cultivate. Having said these words, he invited the strangers into his house, his 2 sons and his 2 daughters, presented them with several sorts of sherbet, which made themselves with kaimak enriched with the candied peel of citrons, with oranges, lemons, pineapples, pistachio nuts, and mocha coffee, unadulterated with a bad copy of Batavia, or the American Islands, after which the 2 daughters of the honest Mussulman perfumed the strangers' beards. You must have a vast and magnificent estate, said Candide to the Turk. I have only 20 acres, replied the old man. I and my children cultivate them. Our labor preserves us from 3 great evils, weariness, vice, and want. Candide, on his way home, made profound reflections on this old man's conversation. This honest Turk, said he to Pangloss and Martin, seems to be in a situation far preferable to that of the 6 kings with whom we had the honor of supping. Grandeur, said Pangloss, is extremely dangerous according to the testimony of philosophers. For in short, Eglon, king of Moab, was assassinated by Ehud. Absalom was hung by his hair and pierced with 3 darts. King Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, was killed by Baasah, and King Elah by Zimri, and Azahiah by Jehu, Athaliah by Jehoiada, and kings Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, Zedekiah were led into captivity. You know how perished Croesus and Astyages and Darius and Dionysius of Syracuse and Pyrrhus and Perseus, Hannibal, Jugurtha, Ariovistus, Caesar, Pompey, Nero, Otho, so on and so forth. Richard II of England, Edward II, Henry VI, Richard III, Mary Stuart, Charles I, the 3 Henrys of France, Emperor Henry IV. You know. I know also, said Candide, that we must cultivate our garden. You are right, said Pangloss, for when the man was first placed in the Garden of Eden, he was put there ut operantur eum, that he might cultivate it. And this is the Garden of Eden, which shows that man was not born to be idle. Let us work, said Martin, without disputing. Excuse me. It is the only way to render life tolerable. The whole little society entered into this laudable design according to their different abilities. Their little plot of land on the farm produced plentiful crops. Cunegonde was, indeed, very ugly, but she became an excellent pastry cook. Paquette worked at embroidery. The old woman looked after the linen. They were all, not excepting Friar Giroflée, of some service or other, for he made a good joiner and became a very honest man. Pangloss sometimes said to Candide, there is a concentration of events in this best of all possible worlds, for if you had not been kicked out of a magnificent castle for love of Miss Cunegonde, if you had not been put into the Inquisition, if you had not walked all over America, if you had not stabbed the Baron, if you had not lost all your sheep from the fine country of El Dorado, you would not be here eating preserved citrons and pistachio nuts. All that is very well, answered Candide, but let us cultivate our garden. So in all the discussion Voltaire shares with his characters Candide, Professor Pangloss, in which they travel the world and discuss why humans suffer, why is there evil and pain in the world, what's the cause of it, can we change, how do we fix this? Voltaire offers his conclusion, and I think this is really why he wrote the book, because as many authors do, he's trying to sell you an idea. He's not writing an academic paper, he's sort of embodying his ideas, encapsulating this part of the spirit of the Enlightenment in his novel through his characters. And so I think what he's basically trying to say is that the world as it was very flawed, and that the Garden of Eden must be cultivated. So there's a sense in which I think Voltaire's statement could be right, and that is, personally, I reject determinism. And if I am determined to reject determinism, then I can't help it. I don't think everything is pre-decided, but that we as human beings have real moral choice with moral consequences. And I think Christianity makes very good sense of that. So there's a sense in which we as human beings are responsible for the moral choices that we make, and that we should certainly try to make things better, more like the Garden of Eden, through charity and love and turning the other cheek as best as we can, as hard as those things can be, loving our neighbor, loving our enemy. And also through the natural sciences, and those things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Science can be used for charity. But there's another sense in which I have come to reject what I see as the naivete of the Enlightenment. And that is, there's in the Enlightenment, in this idea, in this sort of framing antiquity, and especially the Middle Ages, sort of when Christianity was freed from the restraints around the time of Constantine, even though that's usually misframed in history. Christianity could stretch out and spread and develop the ideas that they've sort of kept underground out of necessity for a little while. Well, when the Roman Empire fell, contrary to what I had originally thought, it was Christianity, it was medieval Christianity that didn't cause the Dark Ages, but probably pulled us out of them a little sooner. They saved and preserved a lot of the knowledge that would have been lost when Rome fell. They were still working on metallurgy. Things, I can share some academic books about this, but things I didn't know and really surprised me, and really that I fought until the overwhelming evidence just showed me otherwise. Christianity didn't cause the Dark Ages, even though there has been superstitious Christians. There have been anti-science, anti-reason, proudly anti-intellectual Christians. There's no denying that. I want to be realistic about that. But Christianity itself has developed the universities and the hospitals and charity, a lot of things, a common cultural identity. Kings in Europe, when Rome fell, were promoting literacy. These are things you don't hear about from the Enlightenment crowd. So I think also this idea that he sort of encapsulates that the past is the Dark Ages, and we should trust in human reason and effort, and we can progress. Well, you can see how this really fed into sort of this modernist Enlightenment, even contemporary liberalism, faith in human progress and reason, which, while I believe in science and ability of humans to make some progression, because we have historically, and I believe in reason, I think there's also a sort of naivete about the reality, the darkness in human nature, that later thinkers like Freud had to remind us of. There's something very dark lurking in here. It's not just reason and faith and progress. And perhaps we can see that around us in current events and in here as well. And for me, that's where Christianity offers a fuller picture. But boy, thank you so much, seriously, for taking the time to join me in my library to talk about this book that I think encapsulates the spirit of the Enlightenment. This has been Voltaire's Candide. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you, and as always, God bless.